Greetings, and we are here at Resistance Recovery Book Club. This is session number 8, or book number 8, and it's something that I've been looking forward to doing for a long, long time, but I feel like I didn't have the right dialogue partner until I became acquainted with the work of Michael Martin. And so we are going to discuss Meditations on the Tarot, a journey into Christian Hermeticism.
Well, it's the same one I have.
Is it really? Oh, wow. And we're both all beat up.
It is beat up. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, mine's literally got like tape on the side and everything else. Yep. That's wild.
Mine too.
So just, I guess, by way of beginning, how and when and under what circumstances did you get acquainted with this text?
I don't precisely remember, but I had to be 23, 24, and I wandered. I was at this bookstore where they sold stuff like that, books by Rudolf Steiner, and I can't remember. I got into conversation with somebody. Maybe it was about the Rosary, and he said, "Do you know about Tomberg?" I said, "No." And he showed me this book. He said, "You got to get this book," and it was really an expensive book. I mean, back in 85, 86 or whatever I read it, it was a $30, $40 book, which was outrageous for a book in those days. So I had to save my money. so I had to wait for a good payday. And then I finally bought the book and I started reading it. And I realized, how ill-educated I really was, because I thought I had read a lot. I had not read anything. And secondly, I realized that there were more rooms in the Catholic Church than I thought. So it kind of opened up my imagination to what it means to be Catholic, for instance. Because at the time I was not. I mean, I still, culturally, I was still pretty culturally Catholic, but I had stopped going to church when I was 18. And this book kind of nudged me back toward the institutional church.
What do you think did prepare you for this book? I mean, I was thinking that very same question, that I was pretty young and limited, but there were a handful of things that I thought, made it so I could access the book. Was it Steiner, or was it other stuff too, or?
Steiner, but also, I mean, coming from a Catholic background,
right?
Who was about that far from going to seminary when I was 15. Thank God that didn't happen. But so those two things. I was interested in tarot. I was kind of interested in astrology and stuff like this. But I was also even more interested in mysticism. This idea that people could experience God on a regular basis through prayer. And I didn't really know what prayer was, I think, at that time. Not really.
So a lot of these figures in the book, the Catholic figures, were not unfamiliar to you by name, but you didn't really have a lot of acquaintance with them?
Well, I went to Catholic school. So, I'd heard about Aquinas. I don't think we ever read Aquinas in school. We never, I'd heard about John of the Cross, never read him. Heard about Teresa of Avila, never read her. So one of the great things about encountering this book is it directed me into, at one point I wanted to build a library of all the books mentioned in Meditations on the Tarot. And I made some pretty good headway, but that's a lot of books.
Oh, it's a lot of. Some are in French, but
they are in French, and I was lucky. One of the things that was interesting, one of the people he mentions is Joseph Jean Paladin. He mentions him quite a bit. And I knew about him because when I was 18 or so, there was a show at the Detroit Institute of Arts on symbolist painting.
Oh wow.
And so I bought a book, which I still have someplace. And I was, at the time I was a young poet and musician, and so the symbolist just kind of inspired me about not only art, but what the relationship of religion to art could be, right? So that was getting inspired, and Paladin was this important figure in that time period. I mean, he was an impresario. He was a kind of radical traditionalist in a way, and he was unavailable. And I think he might be just getting to be available in English now. Very few of his books have been translated into English. You can get a lot of them. At least I did. I have a file on my computer of PDF versions you can get from archive.org. I think it was. Maybe it was Google. So a lot of his books, but if you read French, you can find them that way. And super fascinating figure. And here he shows up almost right away in Tomberg. And so that was another thread that kind of drew me into this book. And I, at the time, I was interested in, but no expert at Rudolf Steiner.
Right.
I was 24. I just started reading Steiner.
Right. Well, I guess to kind of match you a little bit, I'll just say 2 or 3 things about who I was when I read this book. I was in the early stages of drug addiction, and I'd gotten in a lot of trouble, and my response to getting in trouble was to flee where I was living. And literally, as I was, I took my tax return, and I got a one-way ticket from Washington to Colorado. And as I was leaving, I ran into this guy in a cafe, and he puts this book in my face, this guy I chatted with. He goes, "You got to read this." And then, I'm amazed just by perusing it. And then he snatches it from me and says, "You can't borrow it." And so I went to Colorado, and in Boulder, I ran into the book. I'm not Catholic, but I had been raised Methodist, so there's, that was helpful. I had a teacher who was actually, I later learned, was quite famous Plato scholar. So that gave me some footing. Read a lot of Gurdjieff at the time, or secondary texts, and he's critical of him. So there's that. But I think it was me being kind of like feeling guilty, or, like remorseful. I think that opened me to this book in a way that I wouldn't have been otherwise. That being said, can we start looking at what was the experience of reading the book for you?
The first time?
Yeah.
It was mind-blowing is what it was. For this kid who went through Catholic school all the way, to read this text where, he's talking about alchemy and Rosicrucianism and, astrology, and opening it up to something that's not, some kind of superficial occultism, but has genuine philosophical and theological depth to it. It was an absolute inspiration. I mean, especially the first 4 letters, right? You go concentration, meditation, sacred magic, gnosis, and it put me. It started me, and I realize this now. I mean, I've read the book, I don't know how many times, but just preparing for today, and I'm looking through my book, and it's, I think just about every sentence in the book is underlined at this point. and I'll show you this. It's kind of funny. So maybe the fourth or fifth, maybe sixth time I read the book, this is probably, I think I had children already, so it's probably the early 90s. I decided I would color all the cards.
Nice.
So you know, and there have been times when I was giving lectures on this, and I taught a class at the university on this book, and it had so many Post-its, and it has a few today just for today's, but it had hundreds of color-coded Post-its according, you know, Sophiology was red, you know, whatever color, astrology was green. It was crazy, but what happened though, it opened up my mind to what is possible, and this idea of Hermeticism, which I hadn't really heard about, you know, which intrigued me, and I think what this book does is it stands in that tradition of Renaissance Christianity, or Renaissance Catholicism, in the tradition of Ficino and Pico, people like this, you know, that which to me, you know, now that I have a PhD in Renaissance literature, you know, to me that moment in the Italian Renaissance was kind of like this beautiful synthesis of the Christian, Jewish, and the pagan philosophy, but also with Hermeticism going back to the Hermes Trismegistus, you know. So, and in fact, I think it's the Ravenna, one of the cathedrals, I can't remember which cathedral, there's actually a mosaic of Hermes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, so he was basically honorary saint in the Catholic Church in some quarters. And I think this book stands in that tradition.
I think that's right. I don't think I would have had any way to appreciate that when I read it. You know, when I read it, I sort of lacked the language to explain what happens, but it felt as though, like, I can get echoes of this reading it in preparation for today. It felt as though that every card, every meditation, every spiritual exercise somehow instantiated the reality of the exercise in my consciousness in such a way that my perception and interaction with the world was illuminated.
Yeah.
And you know, and I had no one to talk to about this, you know, so I'm just sort of going through this experience. Wow. And I guess we could get a little thematic. I mean, one of the things that really jumped out in the first reading was he starts talking about the nature of the heart and the need to link head and heart and all these wonderful themes. But he says that the heart is emollient. And of course, at the time I had to look the word up.
Me too.
And what was really wild was I was living with a couple who I'd been like their best man a few years before, and the marriage fell apart in front of my eyes. And I will actually come home one day and she's leaving him, and he's a complete basket case. And I'm like 24 years old with, you know, no skill sets to meet somebody in that kind of pain. And yet the book just seemed to, you know, I became somebody that I'd never known before. And at the end of it, but when I left 6 months later, he actually said to me, he said, and he didn't know the book. He said, it was as though you became really, really, really sincere. And I was just like, and for me, the book I've really messed with the calendar for about 8 months. I lived in that. I lived in that for months and months after I read The Last Trump. And it was, to this day, I don't know what to make of it, because when it ended very abruptly.
Mm-hmm.
And I've sort of pined for the experience since then. And I think I was unprepared for the experience, and I was unprepared for its ending. So I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. But did you have that sense of elevated consciousness and awareness?
I totally identify with that, because I really think the attentive reading of these exercises, I mean, it really is a spiritual exercise for the reader. You know, you're participating in Tomberg's spiritual exercise as you read through it. You know, you're kind of drawing on his erudition and his broad experience in, you know, Eastern and Western traditions. But even more, I mean, for me anyway, it was about as close as you can get to an Ignatian spiritual exercise without doing an Ignatian spiritual. It's a Hermetic spiritual exercise.
Yeah.
And that was my experience as well. I mean, and then I try to read other things, and you know, nothing worked the same way. You know, this book worked on my soul in a way that very few books have.
Do you have other books that are in the same league? Because I don't.
Probably, maybe, I don't know. Did I have any? I guess the book has to arrive at the right time. I guess for poetry, you know, poetry. What I get through poetry is pretty close to what you know, depending on the poem, right? Very close to what I got through this book, and that's why when I wrote The Submerged Reality, that's the subtitle is Sophiology and the Turn to a Poetic Metaphysics. And that's what I think a lot of that, you know, kind of enzyme, if you want, if you will, began when I read this book when I was 24. Again, and I didn't publish The Submerged Reality or really any book till I was 50. You know, and reading through to prepare for today, I was noticing some things in the Magician letter, for instance, that I really, you know, the thing about keeping silent.
Yeah.
And I felt like, you know, I looking back, I felt like I didn't have anything to say because I wasn't ready to say it.
Right.
It had to, you know, I had all these ideas, of course, and as everybody does, but I really needed to let them age. And I needed to let the ferment work on me. Here's an analogy, right? So we live on a farm and we have a cow, and we get 7 gallons of milk a day. We sell some of the milk, but you know, so you got to do something with all that milk. So I decided to start making hard cheeses. So I'm making cheddar cheese. Well, you got to let it do its work. You can't rush it, you know. Or Parmesan. Parmesan takes 6 to 12 years.
Whoa.
So you have to let it work. And I think I had to let this book and everything else work on me for 25 years.
Well, maybe
before I can really speak out of it.
Maybe it would be good then to talk a little bit about the way the magician talks about silence, because I think that I did not experience silence until I got to that little section where he talks about the zone of silence and breathing silence. And I think I actually had an experience of that. And like you, I mean, I would identify as a contemplative now, you know, 30 odd years later, but
Yeah.
I was not then. So maybe a little something about the role that silence plays in all of this.
Yeah, I had to learn how to be silent, right? And the funny thing for me, I don't know if this is your case, now I have 9 children too, right? So, And that's why when we started to do this interview, I was in a different room because there's never silence in my house. And I was trying to find silence, find a silent place. But I've discovered that, you know, silence is something you have to cultivate. And I don't mean just meditative silence, which that's part of it, but when he talks about concentration, and because of the circumstances of my life, and it's, you know, especially when I was in my 20s, it was nuts. It was crazy, busy time, and who wants to be in their 20s again? Nobody. But I was, you know, trying to meditate then and trying to do those things I thought you were supposed to do. But even that, you know, it took years where, like he says in the letter of the magician, turning every task into a spiritual exercise, which is kind of what very much drew me into poetry and farming and, you know, teaching in a way, is you can turn those things into spiritual exercises, and you develop the powers of concentration that you kind of foster a silent core. And I am not, you know, I come from a loud Irish family, and but my wife says, you know, when I talk about my brother and my sisters, my wife describes me as the quiet one, and I'm so not quiet, but I have over the years, and as it started with this book, trying to inculcate the lessons there, where I've had to learn how to do it within the context of the life I have been given, which took years.
Yeah, that's kind of my time with Robert Sardello affected something similar, to be able to find silence in the midst of anything, which was always working with the heart. There's this place in the book, now of course I should have it marked, where, so Tomberg will start talking about the will. And there's a place in the book where, I don't know, it might be force or something, where he says that the will should never be passive. It's by its very nature active. And it can also be a tool of perception. And he says that initially this will involve a kind of a silencing of everything. I think he speaks specifically of the silencing of the imagination and the silencing of the intellect. And then he makes this stunning theological move where he's saying, really, this is the grace of faith, to be in that place where you're, you know, the time current from the future is coming at you. And then he says, maybe very gradually, the thought and the imagination can become contemporaneous with the will. I find that completely compelling. And I would imagine a poet would just kind of get that.
Yeah. And that's I mean, for me, farming and poetry and music are all part of the same cloth, because there's you know, it's amazing when I have college students how few of them play musical instruments these days.
Right.
You know, so because there's a place with whether it's whatever kind of artistic domain it happens to be, whether fine arts or the practical arts, you know, you get to a place where you're just present to it, right? You don't have to think about it. You're present to it. So playing the guitar, you know, it's interesting. When I improvise playing the guitar, my wife noticed this a long time ago, but then a friend of mine noticed it too. She said, you know what? When you're just improvising on the guitar, you don't look the same anymore. your face changes.
Mm.
Because you get into that presence,
Mm-hmm.
it's a contemplative presence, I would call it, which is, you know, what Tomberg says, right? It's without effort.
Mm-hmm.
Without effort. Look at a carpenter, a really good carpenter. I'm a really bad carpenter. But you look at a really good carpenter, they're present. I mean, if they have to think about what they're doing, they're going to cut their finger or something, right?
Right.
But it's because the tool becomes a part of them, you know, and that's why I don't know about you, but for me, when I see somebody who really knows what they're doing, whether it's with auto mechanics or woodworking, it's just such a delight to watch them in that space, because, you know, and this is why, you know, it's there for all of us. It's not necessarily for these kind of spiritually advanced people, like, or intellectually advanced people like Valentin Tomberg or something. It's something available to everybody.
Yeah, it's part of being human.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet, and this is something that I think is probably very counter right now. That's another thing about reading this book. Just the 5 years since I last read it, given the cultural shifts we've gone through in those 5 years, there's some things that really jumped out that didn't before. And one of the things that jumped out is he said, what you just described, you know, the artist being present to the poem that's coming or whatever it might be, it's never arbitrary. And that to me feels like one of the most, you know, counter cultural moves Tomberg makes. He's saying, no, it can't be arbitrary. The human being has the capacity to act arbitrarily, but there's actually something that's very, I don't know, for lack of a better term, very lawful going on there. And that seems to go against this ethos we have now, where you can be whatever you want to be, whenever you want to be it, basically by declaration or fiat, and no regard to anything. You know, we're trying to cancel the word lawful, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cancel the word nature. You know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, and I think that this, and I would call this the hermetic path, right? This hermetic path, and this, and well, and I didn't discover this till really much later when I was doing doctoral work on Thomas and Henry Vaughan, the metaphysical poet, and Henry and Thomas, who was an alchemist and Anglican priest. And Thomas actually wrote the foreword to the first English translation of the two Rosicrucian manifestos.
Mm.
And what I noticed is that idea of, and he talks about it right away in Meditations of Tarot, of the union of religion, art, and science. It's so important, and Goethe picked up on this as well. Rudolf Steiner picked up on it, but this goes back to the Rosicrucian ethos, back of the early 17th century, and the Vaughan brothers were doing that. And what that entails, especially if you read the poetry of Henry Vaughan, is it's, you know, and I describe it in my very first book, Religion and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England, that for Henry Vaughan, you know, the way to kind of a holistic understanding of yourself and the world and God is through this intertwined relationship of nature, scripture, and the self. You know, so and that's something that's so foreign to postmodern ethos right now, right? It's the farthest thing, you know. You know, I spend all my days with animals, and trust me, there's a big difference according to what gender they're born in, right? And you have to work with that. You can't pretend it does. You don't milk milk a bull. So yeah, I mean, it's just, and it's this idea of living in accord with nature and with God. I mean, that sounds so foreign to today's ethos.
Sure does. And that working with, that really jumps out, because that is, when you read this book, you have a strong sense, and he's always reminding you that, it's not just you reading a book by him. You're in the presence of beings that are in concert, and you have that such a strong sense of that reading the book.
Yeah.
Elementals and angels and the dead and the saints, and just remarkable.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, I think that's that idea of, and I think he says that in the introduction, right? You're calling this is not just an exercise in erudition, but we're calling forth the masters of the tradition because they are present to us.
Yeah.
And that's true. I mean, I wrote in my book, what's it called? The Incarnation of the Poetic Word. The first chapter is about an agapeic reading, right? Toward an agapeic criticism. And the philosopher William Desmond talks about this. And it's, when you're present to a text, and I'm talking about, in that case, about poetry or other kinds of texts, you're not just in the presence of words, you're in presence of a being, whoever wrote it and who's ever invoked in it. And we talked about this before, but the philosopher and mystic Simone Weil, her experience of George Herbert's poem Love, wherein she wrote in a letter to a priest that she learned this poem, she translated it into French, and every time she had a migraine, she would start to recite the words to herself, almost as a kind of prayer. And she said to him, it was during one of these recitations, as I told you before, that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. So I think, depending, I always tell people, my kids, students, said, what you read affects you spiritually. So if you read things that are rotten for you, like rotten spiritually for you, it's going to have a physical effect. But if you read things that are spiritually nourishing for you, they'll likewise have an effect. And Tomberg talked about this in 2000. So it was late 1990. So I was doing my master's degree at a Jesuit university, and I wanted to do it on meditations on the tarot, or I wanted to do it on Tomberg. And I was trying, I didn't know German, knew only a little bit of French. I wanted to learn Russian, so in the process of that, I don't know how it happened, but I somehow got Robert Powell's phone number, the translator of the book, and he was in Germany at the time, and this is before cell phones. So I called Robert, and he called me back because I didn't catch him. We had a long conversation, and he told me, that when he was reading this book, somebody gave him the book when he was studying eurythmy in Switzerland. And somebody gave him the manuscript of it and said, you're the one who needs to translate this to English. And he was not Catholic at the time. And he's reading this book. And he told me he started to have these powerful inner experiences that, that changed him. And he felt he had to enter the Catholic Church, which he did when he was in Switzerland. Years later, I talked to him again. He was in California at that time. And we were talking about, there's this book, what's it called, by Prokofiev, The Case of Valentin Tomberg, which is a poisonous little tract. And Robert said, I told him I had seen it, and it's really a hatchet job on Robert. and on Tomberg, and Robert said, yes, well, a lot of people don't understand then that when you read these kinds of texts, that there are spiritual beings attached to them, and then you're entering into that space.
Yeah, that's right. For the record, Robert McDermott once tried to facilitate a debate about the text between Prokofiev and Powell, and Prokofiev declines.
Sure.
So so you've got this picture of the silencing of the will, the coming into relationship to something spiritual by virtue of that, the leaving behind, at least for a time, the imagination and the intellect, and that's not arbitrary. And then he has a whole card devoted to the human being's capacity to be arbitrary. And seeing how you colored it, will you open up to the devil card? I just wanted to show it to the audience real quick.
Okie doke. The one with no epigraph.
Yeah, really, it has no epigraph. I didn't realize that.
It's the only one. So,
can you just show us the image?
Oh yeah, my coloring job.
Yeah. So what Tomberg says is you've got this figure, this demonic figure, the devil, who is androgynous, and then around his neck are these cords, and then are these two smaller figures to his right and to his left. And he says, first looking at the card, you would think that this demonic being is actually dragging these folks about. But he says he starts unpacking the card. He says that those two beings are, does he say the will and the imagination? I think he says the will and the imagination, two human faculties that can actually create a third.
Yeah.
Even, and to which they will be subjected, although that being is in their creation. So he's not talking about objective evil beings, he's what he calls subjective. He's talking about egregores.
Right. The generation of a demon. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, and he does not really underplay the sort of universality of that or the human capacity to do that. In a way, I feel like he's saying, you're inevitably going to do this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Groups inevitably do it, even the smallest groups. Danger. I mean, I don't know what to do about it. I mean, like the place I most experienced the egregore was in the English department meeting. The faculty meeting, where you just feel that there are things you're not allowed to say. And what is it that's making you telling you that's the egregore, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think in its extreme forms, it will lead to a kind of doubling, where not only you inhibited about saying something or doing something, you actually say and do things that are completely foreign to you.
Yeah.
You know, like people talk about how many ordinary Germans became Nazis.
Exactly. It's how brainwashing happens. Right? We're experiencing a lot of that these days, aren't we?
Oh yeah, in spades. Yeah. So he says that there's the egregore that we create, and he has this little throwaway line where he even says that the human capacity to do this stuff can create these kind of phantasms that they're not necessarily unreal, they're just not, what's the word? Well, anyway,
living in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, he even says it about he makes this little throwaway line about aliens. He says, he's saying, well, the human being's imagination can bring these things into existence, and somebody will see them, and somebody will pass the lie detector test, and there might even be, he doesn't say this, but there may be some tantalizing physical evidence that only goes so far. But he's really suggesting that there's this way that we can populate our world with these quasi-spiritual demonic beings that only
Black magic, yeah.
Yeah, it is magic. And they only get stronger through more and more people believing in them. And then, now you're left with like, well, then what is Hollywood?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with him, but Juan Quiliano, do you know him?
Oh, I love him.
That's what he talks about in his book on Renaissance magic, right? Is that we still have the same thing. Now we call it advertising.
Right. Propaganda.
Right? Propaganda. And that's exactly what it is. Mind control. I mean, it's been so perfected in certain ways, right? But this is the generation of demons.
Yeah. Yeah. And the cultural landscape is actually a currency of demons. Buying them, and
oh yeah, I mean, as of late, what was that thing? The Satan sneakers or whatever they were. Did you see that?
No.
Some hip hop artist, I don't know his name, is marketing a sneaker that has actual drops of human blood. And he only made 666 pairs. I mean, just let's be obvious.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, and so you're seeing artists, actually, now that you mentioned that, there are artists now that are making pieces of art completely out of human fluids. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that
who needs demons, right? We'll make our own.
Right. And it's really robust, it's an industry, it's a whole. And then meanwhile, what Tomberg's pointing to is the good, the true, and the beautiful are still there. And being in the image of God, we are able to come into relationship with those things.
Right. And that's what I think, for people like us, right? That's our task. And that's actually that's the resistance movement of our time. And I think, how to expose the meaning, the truth, beauty, and goodness to a culture that has these Satan shoes, right? But I think it could be that we're I really think of ourselves as living in a dark age right now, but in those times of darkness, there's a seed of light that flowers later. And I think Tomberg is contributing to this. It's often called the age of the Maitreya Buddha, right? But the sitting Buddha. But and I think that's kind of the role of sophiology.
Yes.
I mean, I sincerely believe that. And this is a seedbed of sophiology, which I certainly did not catch the first time I read it, because I didn't have the word for it. But he drops, especially in the 11th and the 19th letters, right? They're kind of a précis of sophiology. But I think that's the thing to come. That's what John the Baptist calls from the future at this point, is to reintegrate the human person into a relationship with nature and the spiritual world. I think that's the task for us right now.
And he talks in the Sun card, he really uses the term Mary Sophia. So he's really linking it to Mariology, but he really is a man with kind of a Russian soul. That's fair to say. I think his mother was Russian. Yeah. So he has this sort of soul constitution that's really open to this kind of thing. Could you just sort of articulate Tomberg sophiology in short?
I don't know if I can do it in short, but I can do it in chapter 19. I mean, he does it in a few different places. You know, in the letter on force, he talks about the various apparitions or appearances of the Virgin Mary to children. And, you know, I always tell, you know, I had a priest who said, you know, look who Mary appears to, kids, peasants. You ever see her? She doesn't usually appear to college professors or scientists, right?
Right.
And we say, what's he say here? Meetings with the Blessed Virgin are so numerous and so well attested that one must certainly at least admit their objective reality. I say at least because this does not satisfy the demands of my conscience. In fact, I would not be entirely honest or frank with you, dear unknown friend, if I were not to say what is an absolutely sure result in the inner form of my consciousness of more than 40 years of endeavor and experience. It is the following. One meets the Blessed Virgin inevitably when one attains a certain intensity of spiritual aspiration, when this aspiration is authentic and pure. The very fact of having attained a spiritual sphere which comprises a certain degree of intensity and purity of intention puts you in the presence of the Blessed Virgin. This meeting belongs to a certain sphere, that is, to a certain degree of intensity and purity of spiritual aspiration. A spiritual experience, just as the experience of having a mother belongs naturally to human family life on earth. It is therefore as natural for the spiritual domain as the fact of having a mother is natural in the domain of one's terrestrial family. The difference is that on earth, one can certainly be motherless, whilst in the realm of the spiritual, this can never happen. Therefore, the thesis I am advancing with 100% conviction is that every hermeticist who truly seeks authentic spiritual reality will sooner or later meet the Blessed Virgin. Bingo. And I think it's true.
Yeah. And it's kind of, in a way, it's the cross of our times, that the good, the true, and the beautiful are, in some sense, being crucified. But there at the foot of the cross is Mary Sophia.
Right. And that's what's also being obfuscated or obliterated or challenged is this idea. I mean, this idea of the motherhood, you know, spiritual mother, or the mother, right? The archetype of the mother, right? It's been diminished for the longest time, and even gender is now being obliterated, which is you know, it's one of the things he mentions it several times here. I would love to talk to Tomberg about what's going on now, you know, see what his take would be. But I think, you know, John Milbank, you know, of radical orthodoxy, you know, he talks about the importance of gendered biblical typology to coherence in the world. And Tomberg, and this is what Tomberg later in the 19th letter, you know, when he introduces the luminous Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit integrated with the Mother, the Daughter, and the Holy Soul. I mean, that to me is prophetic.
Yeah.
You know, right. and I think it's so essential to it's a healing for all the, I would say all the troubles we are experiencing right now in Western civilization.
But it really does raise the issue of spiritual purity, which is another very countercultural idea. I'm reminded of Steiner, I think, in his Gospel of John lectures, where he says, Sophia will actually be born in the human soul once it's achieved a certain level of purity, which is really identical to what you quoted Tomberg was saying a little while ago. And that's you know, so the idea of purity, then you can get that by turning towards nature as well, because there's certainly no, you know, whereas human culture, we're manifesting the subhuman, the sub-natural. But you can't really do that in nature unless you start doing human violence to nature with.
Right. I mean, that's not purity, right? That's a desire to optimize and control,
Right.
and exploit.
Right.
In fact, in the 17th century, the beginning of the scientific revolution, the language that the scientists, going back to Francis Bacon, would use for dealing with nature was torturing nature to make her divulge her secrets, which is what so offended Goethe, which is why he went the opposite direction and talked about an approach to nature that was grounded in reverence.
And worked with the powers of nature.
The phenomena before you, right? That's what phenomenology does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very much in this text, that we are to work with something that's given, but not merely to replicate what already has been reinstantiated, but to actually advance the tradition. Yeah. You know, very, very foreign way of thinking now. So maybe shift a little bit. All this controversy about the person of Valentin Tomberg. So, unlike you, I actually read the book Anonymous Author. It was years before I knew it was Valentin Tomberg.
No, I didn't know either. Well, actually, no, I did know, but I didn't know anything about him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you make of this person, given that he never really found a home in the conventional sense, an intellectual home? I mean, he did, but
yeah, he was restless, because I think, I think there's a danger in. Now, if I had read only this book, I would have. In fact, I had a dream when I first read the book. I think even before I knew about his name, that I had a dream that he was a priest. And then somebody said, no, he wasn't a priest, who actually knew the story. And I told them about it. So we can see him, you know, so he starts off as a kid, basically in Russia, with this group studying the tarot, migrates eventually, at first intellectually, but eventually physically, toward the Anthroposophy. And then he gets kicked out of the Anthroposophical Society. Must have been doing something right. And then I think he had a flirtation with the Orthodox Church for a minute, and then ends up in the Catholic Church. And he just ends up in England. In fact, he lived in the same town that Robert Powell grew up in.
Oh, really?
Robert Powell didn't know it. Yeah, Robert said, I had no idea it was in the town I grew up in. But if you see in the Covenant of the Heart, or sometimes it's called Lazarus Come Forth, you know, you see he's already kind of disappointed in Vatican II.
Right.
You know, and he seemed, I don't know if he has, you know, and a lot of esotericists who are attracted to the Catholic Church have a kind of traditionalist strain, and he almost seems like a traditionalist at times. But I think he is also, and I think in the Meditations on the Tarot, he takes an idealistic or archetypal view of the church and its structures. And I think by the time after Vatican II happened and he saw what was happening from Vatican II, and he's like, wait a minute, wait, you're giving, this is not good. And some people attracted to his work, are also, who actually, there are quite a few traditionalists who are really into Tomberg. But I tend to think that he like Rudolf Steiner himself was never, he was always changing, he's always developing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I say, and I love to talk to him about what's been going on in the church for the last couple decades, see where he's at with that, as I'd like to talk to him about so many other things. But I think he was carrying and I trying to make him a traditionalist, but then reading the stuff on the Mother, the Daughter, and the Holy Soul. I mean, you have to do some pretty fancy footwork to make that happen, right?
Right.
But I think, like you just mentioned, there's this idea of being grounded in a tradition, but letting it grow.
Right.
And I think, his introduction of Sophiology into that tradition, which is why, he's in the Catholic section of the submerged reality. And that's why I called it the submerged reality, because it's something under the surface.
Can you speak to how he's received by Catholics today?
Most have no idea he exists.
Still, yeah.
A lot of people, people I hear from who've read my books who, then get turned on to Tomberg. It's interesting. And now, most of the people I know who are into Tomberg are people who go to traditional Latin Mass people. Others are just kind of, there are a couple I had, in fact, I had a graduate, she wasn't a graduate student, she was in a really advanced undergrad who wanted me to teach her a course on meditations and the tarot. So we had to think of some bogus name like current issues in Catholic theology, so we could get it to pass through the administration. So and she's a person who's really interested in the Hermetic stuff. In fact, she's going to Harvard to work on going to the Harvard Divinity School to work on Hermeticism.
Wow.
So it's out there.
Well, it got such strong endorsements from such big people like Keating and Pennington and von Balthasar.
But it's mostly ignored.
Yeah.
Mostly ignored.
Have you had the opportunity to read Christopher Bamford's little section on him in one of the new re-releases, his introduction?
I think, yeah.
Yeah, I found there's a couple things in there that I found very interesting. So Bamford, in relation to anthroposophy, he makes it pretty clear that, Tomberg wasn't this cowboy just shooting from the hip, that he actually enjoyed a very pleasant, cordial relationship with Maria Steiner until the end. And that, what is it, Elizabeth Reedy?
Rita, yeah.
Yeah, her as well. And that he really just got caught up in the sort of poison tide in the aftermath of Steiner's death.
Mm-hmm.
And that he was disposed of unceremoniously, not unlike Wegman and
Yep.
So I thought that was interesting. And then I thought that what I wanted to do as a result of reading that intro is that little section or that little period of time where he was neither Catholic nor anthroposophist, at least not yet. And he did that course in the
Right.
Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
Have you looked through that?
Parts of it, but I know, in fact, interestingly, you should mention it. Just before we got online today, I've been putting together the latest issue of Jesus the Imagination, the journal I edited, and the theme for this year's volume is the Divine Feminine. And I sent it. Well, Angelico Press is my publisher, and I sent it to them for typesetting. And one of the publishers has been retranslating Covenant of the Heart. And he said, why don't we put this part from Covenant and Heart, where it's the discussion of the luminous Holy Trinity. Why don't we stick this in there too? That's it. Fantastic. But he's also translating the Lord's Prayer course. And so he sent me bits and pieces over the years. Well, he's been working on it for about 5 or 6 years. But it should be out pretty soon. But I have not read the whole thing. But in there, I think that's where he gives the Our Mother prayer.
It is in there.
Yeah. Which I say every day. I added it to the rosary a while ago.
Fantastic. And then have you read the early stuff, the early articles as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When I was in graduate school, I read everything that was available by him in English.
Yeah, and the stuff he wrote on Russia, I found some of the best stuff I've ever read. It's just so insightful.
Yeah, and I love this, the studies of the Old Testament too.
Yeah, I've never gotten through it. That's kind of, the fire's getting rekindled now. Well, this has been better than good. I was hoping that you might be willing to recite the Our Mother.
Of the Our Mother? Can I get stage fright? Let's see if I can do it.
Walk through it, the whole 9 yards.
Our Mother, thou who art. No, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Do I have it written down? Okay.
Well, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah. It's in Covenant of the Heart, though, isn't it?
Which it is, but I think it's
I'll
in this room. Let's see. Hold on a second here.
Well, kind audience. Sorry. I thought I could find it and I couldn't.
I might have it right here. Hold on a second. There it is. I got it on my computer. Here we go. Ready?
Yes.
A second. No, I remember it. No, I'm not off the spot. Okay. Here it is. Here we go. Okay, let me just make this a little bigger so I can see it. Since I'm almost blind. Our Mother, thou who art in the darkness of the underworld, may the holiness of thy name shine anew in our remembering. May the breath of thy awakening kingdom warm the hearts of all who wander homeless. May the resurrection of thy will renew eternal faith, even to the depths of physical substance. Receive this day the living memory of thee from human hearts, who implore thee to forgive the sin of forgetting thee, and are ready to fight against temptation, which has led thee to existence in darkness. That through the deed of the Son, the immeasurable pain of the Father be stilled, by the liberation of all beings from the tragedy of thy withdrawal. For thine is the homeland of the boundless wisdom and the all-merciful grace, for all and everything in the circle of all. Amen. That's how it goes. Amen.
That's amazing. And so she is in the underworld, but omnipresent.
And that's, I mean, and like, I think, and this is great description of our current situation, right? That, and this is, it goes back to the Gnostic myth of Sophia, where she's trapped, she's imprisoned, right? And I think that's, you know, but I've come to the realization that the Gnostics were right in a sense, but the real imprisonment is in our forgetting. So when we awaken to the Sophianic and to Sophia in the world, she awakens, or at least it feels like she awakens, but it's not really her awakening. It's our calling her forth. And I think, to me, this is a gesture of absolute humility. Like, this is, I mean, this is really, if you really want to think about it, this is Proverbs 8, right, with Sophia in the presence of God at the creation. And then was his handmaid or his co-worker, right? But then when you go to the Gospel of St. Luke, when the angel appears to Mary, she says, "Behold, the handmaid of the Lord." That's it's basically saying, "I remember, I'm Sophia." You know, and that kind of, and that our task is to use that imaginative remembering now to awaken the Sophianic, because our salvation depends on it.
And there's a requisite humility on our part.
Yeah, that's the purity that he was talking about, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a beautiful thing in the book that always, from the very first time, where he says the one way to guarantee humility is to encounter a being of humility.
That's it.
Yeah, and once you encounter that being, then you can only be humble in relationship to that.
And that's what Jakob Burma, you know, the Lutheran mystic that he was, and who was basically Sophiology restarts with him in the 17th century. And what he identified the virginity of Mary as her Sophianic being, but for him, with the virginity was not the case of unbroken hymen. For him, the virginity was the purity of soul that she represented. And for him also, that's when he calls, when we come to that intuition of Sophia, it's the kiss. He calls it the kiss of Sophia, right? That's when we receive that kiss, we receive, you know, it's a special. This is what Tomberg was talking about with Hermeticists. They meet the Virgin Mary.
Right. And at the same time, Tomberg really works very strong with remembrance.
Yeah.
The overcoming that remembrance it's a resurrection of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
It's an enlivening. There is some version of the Gnostic myth of Sophia or some commentator that has said something in relation to forgetfulness, that the marriage of Christ and Sophia is an accomplished fact everywhere except in individual human souls.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's up to, that's where we are at the cutting edge of something that needs to happen.
That's the purification of the will, right?
Yeah. Now, the other thing that might be a good way to wrap things up is that Tomberg is not a quietist. He's not merely about illuminism.
Mm-hmm.
He believes that the Hermetic path marries those things. So there is this sort of being out in the St. John of the Cross, the God that is his mode of presence is his absence, but at the same time that needs to come back into relationship with the intellect, so the word can be spoken or the book can be written. And that's the particular vocation of the Hermeticist. Is that fair?
The way I understand it, what he says is the vocation of the Hermeticist is to be present to the traditions of the spiritual traditions of every religion, really. And naturally, he talks about natural religion, right? Which is natural religion is kind of an intuitive sociology. You know, we kind of naturally come to it. People even, and I see this with young people and even old people who are attracted to neo-paganism, for instance. And I know why they're attracted to that, because they want to be connected to the world and to something that's real. And with modernity, most of the Christian churches have distanced themselves from the world. It's become, in a way, urbanized, but divorced from the physical world, the cosmos.
Yeah.
And those neo-pagan types want that reconnection. They know that's something that we need as human beings, and we certainly do. And I think Tomberg, when he talks about the Hermeticist, let me see if I have it marked. I thought I did. I did. I do have it marked. It's fine. For this reason, this is in The Magician. Christian Hermeticism, insofar as it is a human concern, initiates no one. Among Christian Hermeticists, nobody assumes for himself the title and function of initiator or master. For all our fellow pupils, and each is a master of each in some respect. And he says a little further, dear unknown friend, Christian Hermeticism therefore has no pretension to rival either religion or official science. He who is searching here for the true religion or the true philosophy or the true science is looking in the wrong direction. Christian Hermeticists are not masters, but servants. They do not have the pretension, in any case somewhat puerile, of elevating themselves above the holy faith of the faithful, or above the fruits of the admirable efforts of workers in science, or above the creation of artistic genius. Hermeticists are not guarding the secret of future discoveries in the sciences. They do not know, for example, just as everyone at present is ignorant of it, the effective remedy against cancer, etc. And he goes on, as he says, Hermeticism is and is only a stimulant, a ferment or an enzyme in the organism of the spiritual life of humanity. In this sense, it is itself an arcanum or a mystery, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, that idea of serving those things, it's art, religion, and science, through, I wouldn't call it the contemplative life, but I would call it a contemplative engagement with the world. And this is also in the 17th century Rosicrucianism, the idea of not drawing attention to yourself, but going about in the dress of everyone else in your country, observing most of the same customs, but you're carrying this light forward.
Mm. Mm. Beautiful. I think you're a little frozen. No, there you go. Well, with that, let us draw it to a close. There's so much more we could do here, and perhaps we should again. I'm really intrigued about the Lord's Prayer course. So, how can folks find you and your work?
You can go to the Center for Sophiological Studies on our website, the Center for Sophiological Studies.com. Look for Jesus the Imagination. And
when's the next?
That's where I'll be. Pardon
me? When's the next edition coming out?
I even while we're sitting here, we check. Probably in a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. I sent it all. They're typesetting it right now. I haven't seen the artwork yet, but it should be done. And by the last section, I mean the last part of the process is really quick. So just be a couple weeks.
And can folks get it both in hard copy and digital format?
Yeah. No, it's not in digital. I decided not to do digital.
Good. Good for you.
Because I'm fighting the resistance. I want people to, because it's an incarnation, right?
Yeah.
An incarnational process. And if it's just down in the ethers, it's not incarnated.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Michael Martin.
Thank you too. Appreciate it.